Hey everybody, welcome back to Planet Zoo and welcome back to the Dutch city. In today's episode I'm going to work on the main square, the market square in the center of the town, and some of the important public buildings all around it. Now this video is already long enough as it is, so without further ado, let's get into it. Now for those of you who speak Dutch, you might already know what's going to happen, or at least what kind of building this might be going to be. This is what we like to call in Dutch a waag, and in English I believe it would be called a weighing house. At least that's what I found online and on Wikipedia, so that's probably right, but I feel like it's not as common of a sight or as a word as in the Netherlands, where basically every major city still has a waag building, and this is a building where back in the day, before we had all kinds of modern technology, merchants would weigh their goods to be sold on the big marketplace in front of it. Now, I'm saying every big city in the Netherlands still has them, and that's true for most cities, but there are some cities in particular which have really famous waag buildings. Alkmaar, for instance, has a really fancy one with a big tower. Gouda has a very famous one, which is also the place where they weigh the cheese. And fun little rant about Gouda, and yes, I'm still going to right away jump into all kinds of history and architecture rants. Gouda is a city which is famous for its cheese all around the world, but it's not actually the city where the cheese is made. Unlike places like Edam, for instance, the cheese doesn't refer to the region where it's made, but rather just the marketplace where it's traded, which would be the cheese market of Gouda. And for that reason, Gouda also has a very iconic waag building with giant scales inside of it. And to this day, although this is more of a touristy thing, there are still special cheese carrying people who have special equipment to carry the huge and very heavy wheels of cheese to the waag building where they can be weighed, so that just like they did in the old days, the cheese can be sold accordingly. So there are all kinds of interesting traditions that they are still keeping in touch with. But for this town, I wanted to add a weighing building like this, because realistically, if you want to have a Dutch city, you should have one of these things. And it's a very iconic type of architecture as well. Usually when you visit a Dutch city, you can recognize one of these buildings, even if you don't know that a specific building is the waag of that market, because typically they'll have some slightly fancier architecture than the buildings around them. So as you're seeing right here, I'm building this out of stone and adding some fancy windows, not just simple ones, but windows with classical elements and pediments and stuff like that, the small pillars and the whole shebang. So that's one thing, but also there are some typical touches that you can look out for as well. So for instance, on the front here, we have a very large door, and I'm also going to add some large doors on the other sides. Typically you'll find that the buildings are quite large, and they have large floors because they need a lot of space to keep all of their giant old scales. And also there are often some kind of overhang elements to the large doors. It's a very typical kind of architecture. You'll also find that they're often symmetrical buildings with perhaps some kind of tower or other similar decorations, a small dome or spire or whatever it may be. It's just once you've seen a bunch of these, you'll start recognizing that they all look at least somewhat similar. And maybe some smaller cities have much smaller waag buildings that aren't as recognizable from the other ones, but you'll often still see architectural elements that are very typical for this kind of building, even there. So all in all, this building that I'm making here isn't really based on any particular waag in the Netherlands. I just took pictures from a bunch of them and compared them and tried to find some sort of middle ground between all of them, trying to pick elements from different buildings. I think in particular inspirations were the waag in Gouda. Leiden also has a very nice one, and Haarlem. All of those look pretty similar to what I'm doing here, but the same goes for many other Dutch cities. Also, this is a slightly fancier building than some of the buildings around it, so instead of a tile roof, which I've done for some other buildings, I'm just going to go for shingles, because that's often something that you'll find on larger public buildings, which I believe, but I'm not entirely sure actually, is because they're just more expensive than traditional tiles. And once again, you want to have a black roof and not a red roof for your fancy building, if you have the money for it. So that's this here, and I think in the Planet Zoo it was kind of fun to build this as well, because we have all of these Gothic architecture kind of stone pieces that fit very well together and that you can make a custom texture out of to make it seem like you have this facade made out of giant stone elements, which is pretty neat. But then again, on the sides and on the back side, I think realistically the city didn't have enough money to splurge on all sides of this building. So, as you'll often find in architecture across the world, but especially in Dutch cities if you pay attention, the front is often very fancy and has loads of decorations and expensive materials and all that stuff. But then on the sides and in the back, it gets a little bit simpler. So for this building, I'm just adding brick walls on the side and taking the same kind of windows, put them around the same height and give them the same sort of shape, so that from inside the building they would all look the same, but looking from the outside, this one's just a little bit different from the windows on the front. So that's that. I think it also makes it fit in a little bit better with this brick wall. So there's that as well. And then we have the ground floor there, where we just have this window for now, but actually, if I remember correctly, but I'm not entirely sure, I might change that at some point in the future. But we'll see. A bit of a surprise for me as well, I guess. So that's it for yeah, there we go. There's the door. See, I recorded this already a very long time ago, because I'm kind of ahead on my stuff, and there are sometimes some things I forget. Then again, for most of these episodes, I do go back and kind of check what I'm doing, because I have to base the chapters on the addresses of the buildings, and of course, you know, also do some editing and come up with a way to put these videos together. But sometimes there are some things I don't quite really remember anymore. So this is also the part where I decided to add this overhanging roof, which you'll very frequently find on this type of building. I'm not actually exactly sure why they do this, other than that it looks fancy, but there's probably an explanation for this. I just found it on many of these buildings, and while I couldn't find a reason for it, I also thought to myself, I'm gonna have to add one of these things. It's also pretty fun to work on, just a very simple cornice looking structure with some metal beams to attach it to the wall. So it's kind of suspended on the side here, which is a pretty fun touch, I think. It looks pretty cool if you're looking from the front as well, because you get these two things jutting out to the side. So that's the basic shape of this building, and I skipped some footage there where I just copied the elements that I just built to the other side of the building. Gonna return to the back side at some later stage, but for now, it's time to build a spire, which is always fun. Going back to the, well, I don't know actually what we should call this method, but going back to the round spire / dome method to create this, which is always just so satisfying. It's still one of my favorite things to do in this game. It's also partly probably because I'm just a big fan of towers and spires in general, which I've always been, but there's also just something fun about working out one tiny corner of a building and then copying it around and having that dome technique work out to finish the whole thing. And I haven't explained this in a while, but really that's how it works. You put this mud pillar in the middle, which is a grid piece, and which allows you to keep everything centered, and then you either build 1/4 or 1/8 or 1/16 or just half a part of the dome of the spire that you want to build. And then once that part is finished and you manage to build it in such a way that it will be flush if you symmetrically copy it around, then you just copy it around and you finish the whole thing. So in this case, I'm building a quarter of this spire, and sometimes I already do the little spire method to see if my element so far is actually flush. So here you can see I'm just quickly checking, alright, looks good. We can continue. And also I like to make these things a separate building, just so I don't have to worry about accidentally selecting the wrong pieces or how I'm going to copy my thing around. But it's just a little bit easier to build it this way, especially without moving the camera too much, because I do want to keep in mind for these time lapses that I speed it up anywhere between 10 to 15 times. So if I move the camera too much, it becomes, well, honestly unwatchable. So I'm trying to hold the camera still as much as possible, and you have to keep in mind how you use this technique to allow yourself to do that as well. But I think it's not too hard once you get the hang of it. And at this point, I think I'm so used to it that when I play games like this, I hold my camera still much more than people would generally do, because it's kind of become a reflex for me. Not entirely sure if that's what's going on, but it sure feels that way. Anyway, after trying a couple of in-game spire elements, I decided that those things were not worthy. I wanted to have some sort of small dome and also be able to put a small cupola element on top of that again. And there's really nothing in the game which allows you to do that exact thing. So there's no other option than trying to make this dome myself out of shingle pieces. And these are made out of very, very small wooden pieces from the Indonesian building set. Which in hindsight was not the greatest idea, because those things have a small render distance because they're very small elements. So at some point in the future off camera, I had to put a half sphere inside of this dome, so that if you zoom out, you can still see this dome. It just turns into kind of a low LOD version of itself, which is funny because realistically that's what you would do as a 3D modeler for games, is make LOD versions of your objects that are more low poly, so that when people zoom out you don't have to render the complete object anymore. But still, it was a bit of a hassle that I probably should try not to deal with anymore. But I'm saying this in hindsight. I know that in the rest of this episode I'm still going to use those small shingle pieces, and I'm still going to use it for other buildings in other episodes as well. So that's something we're just gonna have to deal with. Anyway, the very final part of this spire is something that I finished off camera, so unfortunately I don't have footage of this, but we're heading to another part of this build, which is Hoofdstraat 11, which is also a building where I didn't record the first part of this. So apologies for me not recording everything, and yeah, I know I'm a YouTuber, I do some work off screen and sometimes it's way too much. At least I'm not like one of those Minecraft YouTubers where you have no idea if the diamonds they mined were actually mined off screen or whether they just got cheeky. I'm trusting them, honestly. At least for all the people in Hermitcraft, I'm pretty sure they hold each other in very high regard, but you know, you never know. At least in this case, I really had to build this stuff. There's no other way that this building just popped into existence somehow. But yeah, I don't know exactly what happened. Maybe I forgot to record, maybe I just didn't feel like recording. Maybe I built this thing kind of as a test and then it turned out to be pretty good. Whatever the case, this is already months ago and I don't have recordings of it anymore. But I'm gonna try to at least talk about my building process and how I got here and what I'm actually doing as much as possible to at least get you guys up to speed. So this is the City Hall, and you might already be able to tell if you're just looking at how fancy this building is starting to be, with all of its shutters and bacon layers and arches above those windows. And specifically, this building is inspired by some buildings in real life, but it doesn't have any particular exact reference. My biggest inspirations were the city halls of Franeker and Bolsward in Friesland, in the north of the Netherlands, but they're also somewhat similar to other city halls. I see a little bit of the city hall of The Hague in it as well, for instance. And once again, just like with the weighing building, I think city halls are often pretty recognizable just by virtue of being very detailed buildings and often having fancy windows with arches or pediments and shutters. Shutters with very particular color schemes as well. Very often they're red, or they have a red-white or red-black kind of cross look to them. It's definitely something that you find on very old Dutch buildings, and by virtue of very often being very old, city halls also commonly have these kinds of shutters. But aside from that, city halls will often also have very fancy gables, which are more than just a simple stepped gable, like this one for instance. We have a pediment on top of it, and then some other kinds of decorations and little bits and bobs all over it. So, pretty fancy there. And also, but now I'm getting into spoiler territory, city halls very frequently have some kind of tower or spire on them as well. So, we're gonna add that at some point in the future here too, but for now, I just want to finish this base layer of the building, which is pretty fun to work on. There are so many classical elements in this game that you can use to make these kind of pieces. And that reminds me, there's something that I haven't talked about in the last episode, but if you're looking at the screen very closely and you're looking at what kind of scenery and building pieces I have in my selection here, you might be able to notice that I made a separate theme for Dutch architecture. And this is something which I think helps me a lot whenever I try to figure out how to do a certain type of architecture in Planet Zoo, which is to make a custom label and go through every single piece in the game and see which pieces you might best be able to use for that theme. Because there are obviously so many pieces in the game that the UI just becomes unusable if you leave everything open all the time. But it also becomes pretty annoying if you keep on having to search for certain pieces or keep having to switch between different parts of the UI to find stuff. So I just like to make myself a list and keep that open of some kind of scenery theme. And very often it also helps to give you ideas of which pieces you can realistically use for a theme, so you're not searching as much in the videos itself. So if it looks like I'm scrolling through the UI knowing exactly what I need to look for, that's true, but it's not because I put that many hours into Planet Zoo. Okay, I did put many hours into Planet Zoo. I'm actually at almost 1,000 at this point, but realistically, that's not as many as some other players have. I think personally it just helps a lot to go through this process of making your own labels and selections of pieces that you like to use, and also sticking with those. Sometimes it's good to adventure a little bit outside of that, but there are so many African pieces that realistically I never really need to use for Dutch builds, so there's no reason to keep those in my selection in the UI either. So that's it for that little explanation. I don't know if you can actually share labels. I don't think you can, but in general, it's my tip to create custom labels. Stuff is fun as well, and you might discover uses for pieces that you've never really thought of before. There are definitely some weird pieces in my custom labels here that were not meant for the kinds of things that I'm using it for. Also, I just skipped a little bit of recording there as well. That was something I didn't record, but also probably messed with a lot. And that is adding these iron beams and also a fancy chimney here. Now these iron beams are something that you very frequently see on Dutch gables, because with stepped gables like this, the gable very often becomes a lot taller than the roof itself. And these iron beams are used to keep it in place and keep it stable, which is pretty fun. And the same goes for that chimney, which also has some beams to connect it to the roof, which you'll frequently find on buildings like this. And also this is a fancy chimney. I decided to build a custom little chimney for myself here, based on the type of chimney that you can very often find on fancy Dutch buildings. And here's the spire, which I'm sorry you didn't see the entire building process of. Trust me, it's mostly just the spire of the city hall, because I wanted to save myself some time, honestly. But also I wanted to make this spire look a little bit similar to the spire of the waag, of the weighing house, I should say. So we have a kind of matching building look here. But I'm only using it as a starting off point. So I'm slightly changing the shape and adding different cornices to make sure that they do look different enough. And because this is the city hall and it's a fancier building, realistically, I think the spire should be taller, it should be fancier, should have more elements. So yeah, we're going ham on this a little bit. So once again, also, it helps to be able to put all of these pieces apart because we have so many different elements. We have the cupola at the ground floor of the spire, if you will. Then we have this little roof segment, and then we have the smaller cupola again. And then on top of that, we're also going to have an extra little dome and spire and tip and stuff like that. For me personally, it always helps to separate these elements as much as possible while you're working on it so that it becomes easier to select them. You don't have to move the camera too much, and you can mess around with the composition and the size and shape of all of these elements. Because once you finish this kind of thing, and I think that's the one downside of the dome/spire technique, once you finish this kind of thing, it's very hard to change it. Once you get the basic shape in place and you put all the pieces together, it's hard to pull it apart and change major things about it. So you have to try to get it right on the first try. So yeah, that's that. Also, because this is a slightly fancy building, instead of a regular round dome, I'm going for onion dome shapes on these segments as well. So we have a sort of half onion dome on the lower part of the spire, and then on the top here we have a small complete onion dome, which is that kind of fancy Renaissance Baroque touch. And that's it for the City Hall. Now, for the remainder of this episode, I'm going to work on a couple of different houses and facades. Because, you know, I'm building a city here, and if I were just to feature 2 buildings in this episode, or even just 1, we would have to make maybe 300 episodes to finish this whole thing. So, for this building here, I'm once again experimenting with something slightly different, but something very Dutch, which I wanted to try and use somewhere as well. And that is a new type of gable. Now, I've talked about the regular sort of triangular gables, I've talked about stepped gables, I've talked about the frame gables, but there are still some more types that we haven't explored yet, and one of them is what we call in Dutch a halsgevel, which I think in English would be a neck gable, but I'm not entirely sure. That sounds a little bit weird and a little bit like too much of a direct translation, but it is what it is. In any case, this is once again a brick building where we're starting off with a ground floor with a bunch of windows, and then a floor above that with 2 windows instead. A little bit adventurous, I know. And this building, I don't think it was based on any specific building in the Netherlands, but it could be. I just can't find anything back in my archives, which is also fun to talk about, actually. Somebody once propped up the idea of sharing my inspirations at some point. Also, this is where you see the neck gable come together and why we call this kind of thing a neck gable. It should be pretty obvious at this point, but it kind of resembles a person in its general shape, you know, this whole building. But anyway, my inspiration sources are usually on Pinterest. Sometimes I also get them on Google Images, but most of the times I make a giant mood board with all kinds of different inspirational buildings, and I just keep that on another screen, so I can always fall back on that to get ideas for what I'm building. I don't like to copy, but it's always good and always necessary, I think, to have some inspirations to build off from. So that's that. Pretty simple facade. Let's move on. Now, once again, I'm building right next to the building that I just built, and we're going for something slightly different. I also don't think this building was based on any particular building in real life, but once again, this recording is months ago, and some of these videos have also taken weeks by themselves to make, which I think is also worth pointing out. It might look like I have absolutely no life and just playing Planet Zoo all day, And while that sounds pretty fantastic, it's unfortunately not the case. I don't have that much time to play Planet Zoo, and most of these bits are also one day of playing at some point. So there's that. These videos are often scribbled together from weeks of gameplay, which is also why my upload rate isn't always the best, but it's also why I'm actually pretty happy that I've been saving up these time-lapse videos to release them in a shorter amount of time, because otherwise it's... I mean, this is a little bit of an experiment, but I'm pretty happy with how it works out to be able to release on a bit more of a usable schedule. On the other hand, the downside is that I can't take any feedback, and in the past this has always been one of my favorite parts, just recording an episode, getting it out there, getting feedback and tips and stuff like that, and actually doing something with it, which I do think is a shame I can't do anything like that now, because I think a lot of my builds have been influenced a lot by feedback that I've gotten. This building, in any case, is kind of similar to the black painted facade that I built in the last episode, just in a different color and with a different plinth. These plinths of these buildings where the window shops would be and stuff like that are actually interesting to work on as well. Usually the upper floors are all very similar, you just have to build some windows and build the general shape of the wall, but for the ground floor there are so many different variations that you can play with, which is pretty fun to do. Also, I should point out, I am building all of these buildings not out of actual walls, but out of smaller pieces, so that I can sink my windows into the building. Now, I know Planet Zoo has window pieces that you can stick on your buildings, and while that looks decent enough, I think any realistic window should be kind of sunken into the wall itself, because that's what windows do. So I'm just going the extra mile to make my walls out of non-wall pieces so that I can custom make windows that actually sink into the walls, which is a lot of work, but I also think it goes a very long way to making the entire build look realistic. So there's that. I don't think I've consciously talked about this, but it's a huge part of what goes into the creative process of making these buildings, so definitely something I recommend trying yourself as well. Now this building is going to be a little bit fancier than some of the ones you've just seen. This is what I would call a herenhuis, and I don't know an English translation for this either, but it's a rich people house from back in the day. Pretty large, much wider than some of the other houses, and I believe the commonly told story about this, which I think is true, is that houses used to be taxed based on how wide they are at street level. Either that or how many windows they have, and these rules are very common in countries across Europe and have resulted in many kinds of different architecture styles. It's why all the houses in Amsterdam are so narrow and so tall, and why if you're a very rich person you would flex on your neighbors by just having a very wide building, besides of course just being fancy in terms of the architecture. So as you can see, we have a roof with 2 chimneys on top of it, which I already pre-made because it was a bit of a hassle to make this kind of roof with the shingle pieces in the game, because they're kind of large and unwieldy. And the chimney I just copied from the chimneys from the city hall. So fancy looking chimneys, fancy looking roof. We got some black tile roofs instead of the proletariat red tiles. And also this is built in the style of Dutch classicism, which is something that for the past couple hundred years has been a very typical style for the aristocracy. It's kind of a stripped down version of the Roman architecture. It's Dutch buildings, but with some touches of classicism. Like for instance, we have some pillars that this entire building is made out of, with capitals on the just below the cornice. The cornice itself, which kind of resembles a Roman temple in a way as well, and then some large windows between those pillars. And while everything is made of brick, you know, it really uses the classical language of architecture. So that's fun to work on in the game as well, because it's not necessarily harder than doing the simple facades. But it is more fun because you can make this building, you know, look fancy and kind of go all out with that. And there are all kinds of different pieces that work really well together with these pillars as well. It's just fun to try and come up with different ways to make these decorations. So eventually these pillars are made out of different pieces that in the game are not meant to create pillars like this. Like the brick pillars, for instance, are not meant to be used with these column capitals. I'm also using 2 types of column capitals right next to each other. But I think it works in the context of the kind of building that we're building here. And personally, I also like that the pillars give a sense of depth to the building, because while they have the same brick texture as the walls, so you don't always notice that they're pillars, and technically speaking I should say pilasters, because they're pillars that are sunken into a wall. It still adds some depth to the building. And also I used shop frames to make the windows on the top floor a little bit fancier. I decided not to do it on the ground floor because I can't do it with the door, because it's too large and it doesn't fit around it. But it was still nice to do it on the top floor as well, and I think it's fine enough to just do it like this. I just added some fancy decorations to the door to make it seem like it has a pediment kind of element to it as well. So that's it for this building. Now we're once again moving to the other side of the canal for a new building and a new experiment with wall textures. This is a wall that I haven't used for a building before, but I did use it for the canal in the last episode. And the reason that I didn't use it for any buildings is because I thought the texture would be too small to fit in with the other textures. So if you compare this, for instance, with the brick texture of the red bricks on the buildings on the left here, it's much smaller, but at the same time, I think it's a necessary sacrifice to make, because this texture is so versatile, because it has 2 colors that you can recolor it into. And I think, honestly, that's genius on the part of Frontier. It's very hard to make a recolorable brick wall that actually looks good, because brick walls are defined by the fact that they have bricks in many colors. Look at any red brick wall and you'll find that some bricks are more gray, some are more brown, some even black or whitish. And this is what defines a brick wall, and this makes a brick a very difficult texture to make recolorable, because if you make a brick wall that's entirely recolorable, it just looks unrealistic. I think it ends up in the uncanny valley of brick textures, and that's definitely something you don't want. But they solved it here by having 2 colors that you can recolor it into. So I'm gonna make use of this texture a lot more. It's still slightly too small for my liking, but I think it's absolutely necessary to make a realistic looking Dutch city. So it is what it is. But I've been talking about bricks for so long that I haven't even caught up to what I'm building here. So just a quick word about this building. First of all, this is going to be moved. This is not going to remain its location, and I'm actually going to copy it around and make several similar buildings based on this one around the city, because I think it's a pretty good looking generic frame facade building. So we're going to use that a bit more at some point in the future. But for now, it's just going to be this simple build. Now this building is inspired once again by a row of buildings in Dordrecht. Just like the first building in this entire series, I just thought to myself, you know, it's a good source of inspiration and I should copy a little bit more from it. And the row of buildings that I'm talking about specifically, and I don't dare show any pictures just in case there might be some copyright issues, then again, I can just go out and take a picture myself. So maybe I'll do that. Anyway, it's a row of buildings on the Statenplein in Dordrecht and a street right next to it, which is one of the most photographed rows of buildings I think there is in the country, at least if I'm to believe Pinterest, because if you look up Dutch architecture on Pinterest, this bunch of facades just keeps popping up, and I think it's also understandable. It's a row of facades that all just look good and they fit very well together. It's almost like they're designed in a theme park to be a fancy Dutch street. But the story behind this is that while these are buildings that are very old and they are authentic, they're not stood in their authentic location, because Dordrecht went through a lot of urban renewal in the 60s and 70s of the last century, and during that a lot of old buildings were demolished, but some of them were saved in this project, and they were moved to a different location, and that location is the Statenplein in Dordrecht, which is why it has one of the coolest looking sets of buildings, I think, in the country. But it's also because it's kind of a best-of compilation of some of the architecture that the city has built over the past couple centuries. So, interesting street, definitely a really cool place to visit, and one of the spots you have to visit if you ever visit Dordrecht. But not super, original. There's something a little bit fake about it, but the buildings are very real. They're just moved from their original location, and very painstakingly too. It's a hell of a process. Which also reminds me, there's a very famous tourist attraction in the Netherlands called Zaanse Schans, where you can see loads of interesting green wooden houses and windmills, and everything there is also not in its original location. They are real buildings and they are truly very old, but they were all saved from different construction projects across North Holland and put in one location to preserve them, which has then become a very popular spot to go to. Which is also good. I might sound a little bit critical at this point, but I think it's really cool to have these sort of best-of places where the architecture is real, and plus they managed to save buildings that otherwise might not have been saved, so I think that's really amazing. But it's always something to keep in mind that, they weren't authentically that way. But then again, what is authentic in architecture? I could talk about that for hours. Anyway, just a quick word about this building, because I got off topic again for so long. This is, again, a stepped gable building with loads of bacon layers, as you can see, and different decorations. A fancy little plinth at the bottom, and also a relatively fancy gable as well, which isn't just a simple bunch of steps, but also has loads of stone elements that were very fun to work on, and we're definitely going to have to use some iron bars to also keep this attached to the rest of the roof. All in all, a fun type of building to work on, not specifically based on anything, but generally inspired by some of the buildings in Dordrecht, and I think it's time to move on to the last building of this episode. So this building is a little bit warehousey. Not exactly sure if it would realistically be a warehouse, but I don't have any warehouses in the city so far. But there is something typical about warehouses and their architecture in the Netherlands. Usually they don't have the fancy gables that regular houses have. They don't have the neoclassical touches of the rich people buildings. Instead, they have simple triangular gables and big hooks or cranes at the top to hoist all kinds of stuff into enormous windows. And they'll often also have large wooden shutters. And again, with these types of buildings, once you kind of get a feeling for what they typically look like, you can start recognizing them in the cityscape, and next time you walk through Amsterdam, you'll be pointing at buildings and being like, that's not a regular house, that's historically a warehouse. And yeah, I think just architecture in general gets more fun when you start recognizing things. Sorry about the noise that I'm making, that might be caught by my microphone, not entirely sure, but I am totally fidgeting with chopsticks right now, so I'm gonna put those away in the corner and hopefully not touch those anymore. Also, I'm making all the hand gestures, which is funny because, I'm recording in front of a screen and you can't actually see me, but, that's part of human nature. Anyway, this building, I'm adding some large warehousey windows to, and a little warehousey shuttered window at the top of the gable here. And we're also adding one of those hook thingies there, which, to be honest, I haven't found a piece, like a metal piece, to actually finish the hook. in the game anywhere. If anybody has any suggestions, I could always add these later on once the series is actually finished, because that's of course how far ahead I am. But with just these things, it's realistic enough, because for many of these buildings in the Netherlands, the hooks have been removed at some point in the past, and only the basic elements are left, which you'll often find for old warehouses, because on the surface, the look of the building is still there, but some things have, of course, changed about it, and most of their functional stuff has been removed. And that probably goes for this building as well, because it's definitely not a warehouse anymore. It's just a house, just as everything else is here. Anyway, that'll be it for this episode. Thank you guys for watching this very long and long-winded dive into Dutch architecture with me again. I'll leave you with some cinematic shots of the town, and I hope to see you in the next one. Ciao! Thank you.